I think I'll hold it there because I'm conscious we've got 20 minutes left, and I'd really like to hear your thoughts and questions for the panel, which you've heard speak for the last 40 minutes. So if I could ask you just to say who you are and where you come from, and who you'd like the question to go to. If we run short of questions, we've got a whole host we can ask each other, but I'd much prefer them to come from you guys. Great, if you could pass that down, that'd be terrific, and I'll hand this over if anyone wants to do the same this side. Gordon.
I'm Gordon Wu from RMS. My question is for Steve. Referring to the use of fire as a weapon, because you said that we haven't seen as much of fire as perhaps you might have done. I'd like to make a point, which is that everyone should be familiar with the Salafist discourse on the jihad. That it pays everyone to read what this discourse is, and there's enough in English translation. Now, a fundamental principle is the lex talionis, an eye for an eye, which means that if you kill my people with fire, we'll kill your people with fire. However, there is a discouragement of fire as a weapon because it is considered that it is Allah's right to punish people in hell with fire. So on that basis, a plain attack using fire would be less likely than other types of attacks. I think that explains why we haven't actually seen so many pure arson attacks. Thank you.
I think that's a very interesting view about it. I mean, it suggests perhaps some of the chaps at London Bridge were slightly off message, given that they did use fire, or intended to it. They had fire bombs with them. But I think that's a very interesting way to look at how they may choose them. But I think always a note of caution that people do go off message. And it's really to your point as well, the splintering of groups and how they then redesign. Boko Haram being a really good example where we've got splintering into one which is doing broadly conventional military insurgency, and the other which has sort of gone ISIS heavy, is another example that people can go off message very quickly as well. So, you know, we don't read our own doctrine in the British military as well as we should do, so it's cautious to use someone else's doctrine all the time as a way to protect them. But it's a very good point.
I think the only thing I'd add on that is I think it was the December edition of Ramah or Inspire magazine which directly referred to the use of arson. No, I'd agree with your point. You know, there's a purist view of their interpretation of Islam, and then there's those rogue elements. And I think we are going to see an escalation of brutality and violence and the use of fire, and the failure on this occasion, fortunately, at London Bridge, that they didn't deploy the petrol bombs. Next question, please.
Steve Coates, Paul Ree. Really for anybody who wants to take it, really. You know, given the sort of wide variety of methods that terrorists have used, it seems surprising to me that there hasn't been more use of fake substances to foster panic. You know, some icing sugar, pretend it's other white substance. Why do you think we haven't seen terrorist groups moving along that fake attack nexus?
Jamie, do you want to kick off this one briefly?
Yeah, no, very briefly. Very good question. And I think they are becoming obviously more intelligent. For example, the chaps at Borough Market at London Bridge the other day, remember, with the fake suicide vests. But of course, who would know that they were fake? And it would certainly deter people from having a go, which is what I was sort of suggesting. Or the police might sort of decide that they couldn't intervene immediately and need to call up special forces. So from the point of view of the terrorists, that kind of fake effect certainly is designed to win you time so that you can carry out even more mayhem. So I think this is a very good sort of thing you suggest. I mean, how is it possible quickly for intervening forces to quickly establish the level of what they call in France dangerosité, dangerousness, so that, you know, they don't, as I say, get it wrong, and therefore more victims are caused than would otherwise be the case. But on the chemical substances, maybe Steve knows more about that than I do.
Thank you. It's a big question that people had. I think one of the things which is possibly in our favour, and it goes not just for hoaxes or the use of CBRN or CBRN hoax materials, but actually in terms of the capability and the expertise in delivering the attacks, we are slightly favoured by them tending towards suicide attacks, because you don't really learn much as a bomber if you're a suicide bomber. So, you know, you get one go and away you go. So that has two effects. One is they're never really any better at delivering it than they are the first time round, though the bomb itself might get a lot more elaborate if the bomb maker is separate from it. And that's the networks we see in Iraq and Syria, and that's our concern in Europe and UK, because if someone makes their own bomb and then they blow themselves up with it, they never get better as a bomb maker. Excellent. If they're actually part of a network that's supplying them with those bombs that are getting better, we might see more complexity. I think perhaps that may also then associate with, if you say to someone, well, what we want you to do is do a series of fake attacks and potentially risk yourself getting caught for something which is not going to have an obvious impact, you know, you can sort of see someone going, well, I'll go in a blaze of glory, but well, I'll go in a blaze of baby powder, is harder to convince. So, but that's mere speculation about that.
Could I, forgive me for coming back in, but there was something I should have mentioned, particularly coming from NATO. We've actually spent quite a lot of time on what we call reach-back facility. Ed will know about this from his military years. We've got mobile labs now, which special forces, particularly in Afghanistan, take out into the field. So if they do come across any sort of tricky substances, they can very, very quickly take samples. We've got CBRN teams now. We're really ramping this up in NATO with the moon suits and the training. They can immediately send this information digitally back by satellite, where we've got a centre in the Czech Republic of Vyškov. I don't know if you've been out there, Steve, the NATO CBRN good centre, where we've established this kind of reach-back facility, which can do the instant sort of forensics and the analysis. So, I mean, again, you know, it takes time, I agree, when you're looking at an immediate response, but it does help you to try to determine whether, you know, if troops are suffering illness, it's food poisoning, or somebody's using a Q fever kind of biological weapon against them.
Question at the back, and then the gentleman here.
I was just going to add one
sorry,
thing. Sorry.
Deborah.
So this is a little bit akin to what you're talking about, Steve. We've been, as I mentioned in my presentation, doing a lot of work with New York City. And one of the things that the counterterrorism folks there are very concerned about is not that it would necessarily be a fake attack, but that there would be a diversionary attack. And so that a very large bomb would go off, you have hospital first responders responding to it, focused on that aspect, leaving uncovered other areas where then you could allow the terrorists to go in and get far more lethal material that they were doing about that. So it's a little off of what you specifically have said, but it's the diversionary part of it as opposed to just faking something to terrorize people.
Just a word. Paris attack was a little bit like that because Bataclan was hidden with other attacks behind. So the concept was there. Just to answer, maybe you will have 10 fake attacks, but maybe you will have one true. Because if you have never true attacks, it will never work at some point. So I think you must be very vigilant about what is the trend and what's happened everywhere in the world to see what's happening, because it's not very complex. Believe that it's always complex, or CBRN is fully complex, it's a mistake. Some things are complex, not everything. So,
thank you. Who's got the mic at the back there?
I have not
Thank you.
turned on. It's Simon Thurgood from Lancashire Insurance. What we haven't discussed, I think, so far is the oxygen, is the relationship with the media, the 24-hour rolling misery. Now, we've discussed earlier that Osama bin Laden took it very, very seriously, but those videos look dated. The organizations keep on going through processes where they're learning. I'm sensing that another series of low events is going to start to move down editors' commissioning. They won't get to the top of news. So I think people have to be ready for change. This is a question for anybody, really, but what do we anticipate that change might look at? A discussion that I'd heard was that as this starts to move down 24-hour moves, that people may move back to high-severity events, or that they might move into different type of events. Is there anything that
I
think the panel could give us on that?
I think it's very good, and I'll pass this in a second to Jamie as a former NATO media spokesman. He probably knows media better than anyone here, but others may have a comment. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the whole propaganda of a deed and this sort of persistency of attacks, will it get to the state of, going back to my original days in Northern Ireland, where a soldier or a policeman was killed, it was page 7. It wasn't in the news, but that was a long way into the campaign. It made Northern Irish news, it didn't make mainland news. I think this is all really tied to Jamie's point, which I think we can throw open wider, is what I like the term of the resilient citizen. You know, are people becoming more alarmed? How many attacks is it going to take place? How apprehensive and nervous will people become? even if it's not headline news on the front page of the main papers. My concern is I don't think it's going to drop off the agenda at the moment. It's been super politicized in terms of police resources. We saw this in the British election, and probably the same here, and Christian might comment on the French side and Deborah on the US side. So I think we're a long way off that, falling off the headline piece, but I think Jamie will probably have much more professional insights into that.
Thanks, Ed. It's a tough one because obviously even minor terrorist attacks provoke this wall-to-wall coverage. I mean, last week I got out of bed in Brussels, turned on Radio 5 Live to get the morning business report. There was the Finsbury Park event, so all of the programmes cancelled, wall-to-wall coverage, you know, throughout the day. And that was an attack which, no matter how regrettable, nobody was killed directly, as far as I understand, at the hands of the attack. Somebody had a heart attack, but which was an ongoing situation. And so certainly, yes, the media wall-to-wall coverage does represent a triumph. It encourages ISIL to immediately claim responsibility, whether they have been involved or not. And in this country, Bernard-Henri Lévy, a famous French intellectual, French here know him well, you know, actually proposed a sort of a covenant of the media a few years ago that they would, you know, really not sort of go down this road. That they, as you say, they would do much more sort of sober reporting, stop this sort of, you know, breaking news, wall-to-wall coverage, and move on. Difficult, though, of course, given that, you know, if it bleeds, it leads. This is a famous media principle, and you know, we know that, for example, in the United States, why did the media cover the Trump campaign? Which gave Trump a tremendous boost. It was because Trump said outrageous things, which made him interesting. And for CNN and others, even though they were not in the Trump camp, certainly Fox, it drove up the advertising revenue. You know, that's it. You know, covering Trump was good for business. You could charge, you know, $1 million for a 1-minute advertising slot during a Trump rally, and a Hillary Clinton rally, you'd barely get $20,000 for it. I think, Ed, very briefly, although this goes a little bit beyond terrorism, I mean, Steve mentioned very clearly the issue of debunking fake news. And I think, you know, here in France, Le Monde, but also BBC, you know, the media are now setting up more of these fact-checking, myth-busting sort of fake news sites, so that at least for that kind of fake type of attack, which you mentioned Louisiana and so on, they can be more involved in dealing with that. The second thing, of course, in terms of cyber attacks, you know, you had this very good example in France when we think Russia was trying once again, you know, to discredit the election, you know, in the shape of Emmanuel Macron, and they had another sort of attempt, you know, to dump a lot of stolen emails just before the election. The French media came together and said, we're not going to play the same game as the US media. You know, we're not going to go down this road. This is clearly a manipulation attack. We're not going to cover it at all. And the thing sort of was a damp squib here. You know, there's not an easy answer because, you know, the media culture is, as I say, if it bleeds, if it leads. But I think that this is a dialogue that we need to have. By the way, there's just one other element which I didn't mention in my talk, but which relates to this. After an attack like Manchester, we see in London this incredible outpouring of civic spirit. You know, everybody comes together with flowers, and the community and the imams and so on, and the religious leaders. And for a few days, there's a sense of, you know, we will resist kind of thing. But one of the issues, I think, is how do we translate that initial outburst of solidarity, we're not going to be, you know, affected by this, into a kind of long-term community engagement? Because I have the impression after a couple of days it dies down again and everybody goes back to their ghettos and the Muslim community feels sort of isolated and stigmatized. You get the kind of thing, and we don't use these attacks to build, you know, apart from this initial spasm of emotion, the long-term community engagement which we're going to need to get the intelligence and information to catch these people. Thank you.
Deborah, we're in from a sort of US perspective on that question.
Yeah, so one of the things that we worry about is very much that because of this 24/7 media cycle, is that these issues are not always well understood. And so you could have a scenario where there was some kind of, say, dirty bomb detonation or some kind of theft of radiologic material, and in the press of trying to get the news out quickly and not necessarily always in the most informed way, it could then lead to far greater panic with respect to the public. You know, there's some kind of nuclear bomb about to go off, et cetera, and sort of the ramifications on that. And there's not an easy answer, given the structure of journalism and media and the turnover and what they are covering, but it is something that we do worry a lot about in terms of that in and of itself just increasing the panic. And I will remain calm and not comment on Trump.
Thank you. There's a gentleman at...
Thank you.
A gentleman at the back.
Thank you, Alexis Vadron, Swiss Re. I'd be interested to listen to your views on another dimension of the nuclear threat landscape, which we have to do with the vulnerability of nuclear power plants, and especially with the new technologies, the drones, the cyber, and so on. If you have.
I'll ask Deborah and then Christian to just respond on that, please.
So the good news is, with respect to nuclear material, there's been a lot of progress that's been made. The amount of nuclear material is decreasing. Started off, it was 45 countries. We're now down to 23. And I think there's increasing awareness amongst countries with respect to better safeguarding of that nuclear material. One of the areas where we actually worry a great deal about is the potential for cyber attacks on nuclear facilities, both for the purpose of disrupting the operation itself, but also the risk there of trying to steal the material and the area of sabotage. So while there is certainly good news on this front that a lot more has been done, there still remains a lot more to be done.
Yeah, before to answer, I just wanted to jump on the previous one. I think government, when there is an attack, we are going to put 5,000, 10,000, 15,000 policemen more, or security forces more, and so on. We must stop with that. We must think about how we make population resilience, how we train journalists, because they are not trained. Government should offer training to journalists. It will save a lot of money and political effort doing that kind of things. And this is not in the mind. So we have to change our mind. Stop, because 10,000 policemen will not change the threat and not change the response. So we have to think to put our money on a clever way. Regarding the nuclear, a lot of progress have been made also in France for many years. I don't speak about the nuclear grade material military one. I speak about only a nuclear plant. Tomorrow morning we organize a breakfast meeting in the Senate with the first commander of the nuclear security command from the French gendarmerie. It's a new command which has been set up a couple of months ago, and now all our plants, it was the case before, but it has been very much reinforced under the control of the French gendarmerie with special units in charge of the security. Remain the cyber issue, which is a very look by the French government and the French agency. It's really remain a threat because, as you know, SCADA is very difficult issue in cyber, but I think that it's really one looking. We have done in France a new regulation for all critical infrastructure operators. We were talking about that. I think it's a great idea which came in 2006, so it's a long time ago, and now I would say that 10 years after, it starts really to bring a lot of things. But it's a continuous effort because the threat is evolving all the time, but the basics are there. I'm not so worried. I'm more worried about the interface between politics, population, news, media, regarding the fact itself. And that is really the point where we have to make an effort.
Thank you. There's a gentleman at the back, please.
Yeah, I'm Robert Muirwood from RMS. I assumed after the Nice use of a truck as a weapon, I assumed that the security services would have established that every time anybody wanted to rent a van, they would have their name checklisted against a list. But actually what happened in London on London Bridge implies that was not actually the case, which sort of astonishes me in terms of actually of how the security has been rolled out. So I'm interested in your comment on that.
Jamie, do you want to start that and then we'll...
Well, you remember 9/11, where people at flying schools didn't alert the FBI in a timely way that they had candidate flyers who were only interested in taking off and didn't ask any questions about landing the plane. I don't mean this as a joke, because this was a more innocent age, but you're right, particularly as apparently the credit card didn't work for the individual to be able to hire the truck. and then he was still allowed to be able to hire a van. So I think you're right in terms of public education for looking for sort of unusual activity. How we sort of organise this. Again, is this something where people would be sanctioned? It's very difficult to say for a human error that they should be sanctioned, but it does suggest at least that we need to get out more public information into the attack methodologies, so that people, for example, in hotels and so on, are more aware of what to look out for. But again, do we want to go for a kind of Second World War sort of German occupation type of regime where everybody is sort of spying on everybody else? It's not an easy one. Just one, on the previous question, before we leave it, I think Ukraine is a very interesting country to watch on this issue of the safety of nuclear power plants, because Ukraine has them, and Ukraine is a country which is being systematically attacked in a very violent way through cyber virtually every day of the week, and some extremely sophisticated hacking tools have been used. You think of black energy against the power grid, for example, the kill chain, the crash override now, which is the latest one for SCADAs. And I think often in NATO we consider, for example, that Russia is probably using Ukraine as a kind of testing ground for these type of malware devices to see how effective they are. And so watch very carefully Ukraine, because it's a kind of experimental laboratory for these kind of attacks on critical infrastructure.
Very briefly, Steve.
It's a very quick one. Although I think it seems a very logical thing to do to check everyone, it becomes this: are you looking for the needle, or by sort of trying to find the needle, or are you trying to find the needle by removing all the hay? Because if you think about the number of people that hire vans every day, the infrastructure you need to have a database being checked for that, and then more importantly, what do you do when there is a positive? That becomes a massive decision you can't do very quickly. And as a further one for that, even with the financial data, we did some work with Visa about tracking their transactions. Some elements of the financial process don't know where the transaction is taking place. So Visa don't know where the transaction is taking place. They know it happened, they know transaction numbers, but they don't actually know where the transaction happened. So I think it's a point that needs to be looked at, but I can understand why there wasn't a quick reaction to it, potentially.
Yeah, I'll just sort of add one rider and then wind up, conscious it's sort of coffee time, is that we're trying to work much more closely with the Home Office and other government departments in the United Kingdom about this information sharing and collaboration. They provide more information about what the threats are, what the judgments are about those threats, which get out into the business community, not just the insurance sector, through the market, but advising people of what the threat means, what the methodologies are, what they can do about mitigation, but also what advice do you give to hire companies, what advice do you give to chemists when people are buying vast quantities of particular material which could be used. What do they do if they report suspicious smells? What advice to taxi drivers? There's always instances. Certainly the UK government is coming round to that, but they are still reticent from a sort of operational security perspective of releasing information, which is already out there in the public domain. So I think there will be progress on that, but Steve highlighted just some of those issues. Conscious of we're at the end of our session, I'd just like to thank our panelists on your behalf, but sort of leave you with some thoughts which I just scribbled down. I think Jamie made the point, what's the sum of the parts? If we have lots of little attacks over the next 3, 6, 9 months across Europe and across our own home countries, is that going to have a greater impact than a big 9/11? But we can't discount the macro event, and we know that Al-Qaeda is very clear in its intent to deliver another spectacular event, and the warnings were very specific to United Kingdom. Deborah talked about destruction versus disruption, actually the disruptive effects greater than the destructive one-off, which is probably covered by the market in terms of a building being destroyed. I think we need to be considering that certainly under the non-damage business interruption. I like the resilient citizen. What's the role of a citizen? How do we make ourselves more resilient? Yes, we can do that from a business perspective, all protecting our bottom line and profits and everything else, but what's our overall duty as corporate citizens to make sure that our people are safe and we can live in the style we want to be? Steve made the point about not thinking through Western eyes. I think that's equally applicable to the insurance sector. We're probably still very conventional way we think, oh, well, that's what we cover, we don't cover other things. So what about those implausible scenarios, without getting into the funny ones, which Steve's obviously modelled? But what could happen which we haven't thought about, the black swan event, and are we prepared for a potential loss on that? The resources we really touched on, not just police and security intelligence resources, but we are really stretched on that. And how do we start from a business perspective to do something about that? And then the regulatory and the restrictions. And Christian talked about, you know, soldiers, French soldiers not handing over their weapons. We talked about the London Fire Brigade not going into areas where there's still an ongoing attack. So there's a huge regulatory, whether it's intrusive surveillance, Jamie, you talked about. I hope that's given all of you a flavour, some of the complexity. It may have made you more confused. It's probably made me more confused. But at least we've scraped, hopefully, some of the surface for it. And these gentlemen and ladies will be around all day. And a quick plug, if you want to read our terrorism report, which captures a lot of these issues, it's outside on the coffee tables. But can I thank the panel on your behalf and on IFTRIP's behalf for taking up their time to come here and sharing their insights and experience.